Tonight, we turn our attention to one of history's most controversial and misunderstood thinkers, a man whose very name has become synonymous with cunning and ruthless ambition. We will explore the mind of Niccolò Machiavelli and the profound dilemma at the heart of his philosophy. What happens when our highest moral ideals collide with the harsh demands of political survival? Imagine, if you will, a leader standing at a crossroads in the dead of night. Down one path lies the road of principle, of doing what is morally right regardless of the consequences. Down the other lies the road of pragmatism, of doing what is necessary to survive, to protect one's people, to preserve the fragile order that keeps chaos at bay. The choice seems clear in the abstract. Surely, we think, a good person would choose principle every time. But what if choosing principle means watching your city burn? What if your moral purity costs thousands of innocent lives? What if the only way to achieve lasting peace is through a temporary darkness? This is the question that haunted Machiavelli, that drove him to write one of the most scandalous and influential books in Western history, and that continues to trouble political leaders, business executives, and ordinary people like ourselves to this very day. There is no easy answer, and perhaps that is precisely why this question has such power. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the world does not always reward virtue, and that sometimes the path to good outcomes runs through morally questionable territory. As you settle into the comfort of wherever you are listening, allow yourself to be transported back 5 centuries to a world of soaring cathedrals and scheming princes, of artistic brilliance and political treachery, of idealistic dreams and brutal realities. The journey we undertake tonight is not merely historical. It is a journey into the depths of human nature itself, into the eternal struggle between what we wish the world were and what it actually is. To understand Machiavelli, we must first understand the world that created him. 15th century Italy was unlike anything else in Europe. While the rest of the continent labored under the weight of feudal kingdoms and the remnants of the medieval order, the Italian peninsula had fractured into a constellation of independent city-states, each one a world unto itself, each one locked in perpetual competition with its neighbors. Florence, the city that would shape Machiavelli's destiny, stood at the heart of this turbulent landscape. It was a city of contradictions, a place where sublime artistic achievement flourished alongside cutthroat political intrigue. The same streets that witnessed the unveiling of Botticelli's masterpieces also ran red with the blood of political assassinations. The same banking houses that financed the Renaissance's greatest works also bankrolled armies and bribed foreign powers. The Medici family had dominated Florence for generations through a peculiar combination of wealth, patronage, and political manipulation. They were not kings or princes in the traditional sense. Florence maintained a fiction of republican government, with its councils and elected officials. But everyone understood that real power flowed from the Medici palaces. Lorenzo the Magnificent, as he came to be known, was perhaps the greatest of them all, a man who combined genuine artistic sensitivity with an iron grip on the levers of power. Under Lorenzo's rule, Florence reached heights of cultural achievement that still take our breath away. He gathered around him the greatest minds of his age, poets and philosophers, artists and architects, scientists and scholars. The Platonic Academy flourished under his protection, reviving ancient wisdom and sparking new intellectual ferment. Michelangelo received his earliest patronage from Lorenzo's court. Leonardo da Vinci walked these streets. The air itself seemed charged with creative energy. But beneath this golden surface, darker currents flowed. Italy was a chessboard, and the pieces were constantly in motion. The great powers of Europe, France and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire looked upon the wealthy Italian states with hungry eyes. The papacy in Rome played its own elaborate game, sometimes blessing military campaigns, sometimes conspiring against secular rulers, always seeking to expand its temporal power alongside its spiritual authority. And then there were the condottieri, the mercenary captains who sold their swords to the highest bidder and switched allegiances as easily as changing cloaks. These men of violence prowled the Italian landscape, sometimes building their own petty kingdoms, always threatening to upset the delicate balance of power. In such a world, survival required not just strength but cunning, not just virtue but what Machiavelli would come to call virtù, a word that encompassed skill, cunning, adaptability, and the sheer force of will necessary to bend fortune to one's purposes. When Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, the fragile stability he had maintained began to crumble. His son Piero lacked his father's gifts, and within 2 years the Medici were in flight, driven from Florence by a combination of popular uprising and the machinations of a fiery Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola was, in many ways, the polar opposite of the Medici. Where they embraced worldly beauty and classical learning, he preached hellfire and demanded a return to austere Christian virtue. Where they cultivated the arts, he organized bonfires of the vanities, where citizens were encouraged to burn their fine clothes, their mirrors, their paintings, their musical instruments, anything that might distract from the contemplation of divine judgment. For a brief, strange moment, Florence transformed itself into something like a theocracy. Savonarola ruled not through formal office, but through the sheer force of his prophetic authority. He claimed visions from God, predicted the coming of divine punishment upon sinful Italy, and demanded that Florence become a new Jerusalem, a city of saints in a world of sinners. The young Machiavelli, just entering adulthood during these tumultuous years, watched it all with keen and skeptical eyes. He would later dismiss Savonarola as an unarmed prophet, observing dryly that while armed prophets conquered and held power, unarmed ones came to ruin. And indeed, Savonarola's end came swiftly. Pope Alexander VI, that most worldly of pontiffs, excommunicated the troublesome friar. Popular support evaporated as quickly as it had formed. In 1498, Savonarola was arrested, tortured, until he confessed to false prophecy, and burned at the stake in the very square where he had once held his bonfires of vanity. From these ashes, a new Florentine republic emerged, and with it, young Niccolò Machiavelli's political career.
He was just 29 years old when he was appointed head of the Second Chancery, a position that would thrust him into the heart of Florentine diplomacy and statecraft.
For the next 14 years, Machiavelli would have a front-row seat to the political theater of his age, watching as princes rose and fell, as alliances formed and shattered, as the most carefully laid plans crumbled before the storms of fortune. His diplomatic missions took him across the breadth of Europe. He traveled to the court of Louis XII of France, observing how a great monarchy functioned and how it viewed the fractious Italian states as chess pieces to be moved at will. He journeyed to Germany, studying the structures of the Holy Roman Empire. He met with popes and princes, mercenary captains and republican leaders. Each encounter added another layer to his understanding of how power actually worked, stripped of the pious fictions that clothed it in public discourse. But of all his diplomatic experiences, none would prove more formative than his encounters with Cesare Borgia. Cesare was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia before his elevation to the papal throne. The Borgia name has become synonymous with corruption and cruelty, and not without reason. Alexander VI was perhaps the most openly worldly pope in history, a man who made no secret of his mistresses and his ambitions for his children. Cesare himself had been made a cardinal at 18, not out of any religious vocation, but simply because his father needed a family member in the College of Cardinals. But Cesare was not content with ecclesiastical power. In 1498, he became the first person in history to resign the cardinalate, trading his red robes for a sword and the title of Duke of Valentinois. granted by the French king. With French troops at his back and papal money in his coffers, Cesare set out to carve a kingdom for himself from the patchwork of small states in central Italy. Machiavelli was sent to observe Cesare's campaign in the Romagna, ostensibly to negotiate on Florence's behalf, but really to assess this dangerous young prince who was rapidly becoming the dominant force in Italian politics. What he saw fascinated and disturbed him in equal measure. Cesare was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly without scruple. He conquered cities through a combination of military force and political manipulation. He made promises and broke them when convenient. He employed agents to do his dirty work and then sacrificed them when public opinion turned against their methods. He played factions against each other with masterful precision, always keeping his enemies off balance, never revealing his true intentions until the moment of action. Machiavelli had the opportunity to observe Cesare up close during diplomatic missions in 1502 and 1503, and what he saw left an indelible impression. Here was a prince who seemed to embody everything Machiavelli would later theorize about effective rule. Cesare understood that in politics, appearances mattered as much as reality. He cultivated an image of invincibility even when his actual position was precarious. He inspired fear without provoking hatred, at least until near the end. He moved with decisive speed when circumstances required it, catching his enemies before they could organize against him. One of Cesare's most impressive qualities was his ability to recruit and motivate capable subordinates. Unlike many rulers who feared talented underlings as potential rivals, Cesare recognized that his success depended on attracting the best men available. He rewarded competence generously and punished failure severely, creating an organization that operated with unusual efficiency for its time. His military forces, while relying partly on mercenaries like most Italian armies, included a growing corps of loyal troops personally devoted to their duke. One episode in particular would become famous through Machiavelli's later writings. When Cesare first conquered the Romagna, he found it in chaos, plagued by lawlessness and disorder. He appointed a man named Ramiro de Orco as his governor, giving him virtually unlimited authority to restore order by whatever means necessary. Ramiro was brutal and effective. He crushed resistance with an iron hand, and soon the region was pacified. The methods Ramiro employed were savage even by the standards of the time. He executed without trial, tortured freely, and terrorized the population into submission. But the results were undeniable. Where once there had been chaos, now there was order. Where bandits had roamed freely, now merchants could travel in safety. The price in blood was high, but the peace purchased was genuine. But Ramiro had become hated for his cruelty, and Cesare understood that this hatred threatened to transfer to himself. The people did not know that Ramiro had been acting on Cesare's orders. They believed, or could be made to believe, that Ramiro had exceeded his authority, that his excesses were his own rather than his master's. Cesare saw an opportunity. So one morning the people of Cesena woke to find Ramiro's body in the public square, cut in two, with a bloody knife lying beside him. The message was clear. The cruelty had been Ramiro's, not Cesare's. The Duke had punished the excessive agent and delivered justice to the people. It was a masterstroke of political theater, simultaneously eliminating a potential rival, satisfying the population's desire for vengeance, and absolving Cesare himself of responsibility for the very policies he had ordered. The populace, which had trembled under Ramiro's rule, now celebrated their liberation by the Duke who had appointed him in the first place. The narrative had been perfectly controlled. Cesare emerged not as the author of the brutality, but as the hero who ended it. Those who had whispered against him now praised his justice. The state he had created through terror was now legitimized through an act of apparent mercy. Machiavelli was simultaneously appalled and impressed. Here was a man who understood that politics operated by its own logic, separate from private morality. Here was someone who grasped that in the brutal contest for power, squeamishness was a luxury one could not afford. Yet here too was someone who understood the importance of appearances, who knew that a ruler must seem virtuous even when he could not be virtuous, who recognized that the goodwill of the people was itself a form of power that could not be entirely ignored. For years, Cesare seemed unstoppable. He conquered state after state, built an increasingly professional army, and laid the foundations for what might have become a permanent kingdom in central Italy. Machiavelli, watching from his diplomatic posts, began to think that here at last was a prince capable of unifying Italy, of driving out the foreign powers, of ending the endless cycle of invasion and fragmentation that had plagued the peninsula for generations. And then, in a matter of weeks, it all fell apart. In August 1503, Pope Alexander VI died suddenly, likely of malaria, though rumors of poison swirled as they always did around the Borgias. Cesare himself fell desperately ill at almost the same moment, probably from the same disease. While he lay bedridden, unable to act, his enemies moved against him. The new Pope, Pius III, died within a month. His successor, Julius II, was a long-standing enemy of the Borgias. Cesare, still weakened by illness, made a series of miscalculations. He trusted Julius II's promises of safe conduct and found himself arrested. His territories were stripped away, his carefully built army melted away. Within a few years, the man who had seemed destined for greatness was dead in obscurity, killed in a minor skirmish in Spain at the age of 31. His body stripped naked by his killers and left in the dirt. Machiavelli would later analyze Cesare's fall in The Prince, concluding that Borgia had done everything a new prince should do to secure his position. Everything except prepare for the possibility that he might fall ill at the same moment his father died. It was bad fortune, Machiavelli conceded, but a truly great prince should have anticipated even that unlikely contingency. Yet despite this failure, Machiavelli held up Cesare as the model for aspiring rulers. If you wanted to know how a new prince should act, he wrote, you could do no better than to study Cesare Borgia. But Machiavelli's years of observing men like Cesare came to an abrupt end in 1512. That year, a Spanish army invaded Italy to restore the Medici to power in Florence. The republic that Machiavelli had served was destroyed. He was removed from office, accused of involvement in a conspiracy against the new regime, arrested, and tortured. The method was the strappado. His hands were tied behind his back, and he was hoisted by a rope until his shoulders dislocated. He was dropped repeatedly, each fall tearing at his joints. He confessed nothing, because there was nothing to confess. He had simply been a servant of the Republic, now swept away by the tides of fortune. Released from prison but banned from political life, Machiavelli retreated to a small farm he had inherited from his father near the village of Sant'Andrea in Percusina, about 7 miles from Florence. Here, in exile from the world of power he loved, he began to write. We know something of his daily life during this period from a famous letter he wrote to his friend Francesco Vettori in December 1513. In the morning, he tells us, he would rise early and go to a grove he was having cleared, spending 2 hours overseeing the work. Then he would visit an inn on the road, chat with travelers, learn what news he could of the wider world. He would return home for lunch, then spend the afternoon at the inn again, playing cards and backgammon with the locals, common men of little education. The games would grow heated, and they would quarrel over pennies, their shouting audible from outside. But then, as evening fell, something remarkable happened. Machiavelli would return home, remove his muddy, ordinary clothes, and dress himself in the robes of a courtier. Thus properly attired, he would enter his study and spend 4 hours communing with the great minds of antiquity. For those hours, he tells Vettori, He was no longer a fallen diplomat playing cards with innkeepers. He was a participant in the eternal conversation of history, questioning the ancients about the reasons for their actions, and they graciously answered him. It was during these evening sessions, surrounded by his books, that Machiavelli wrote The Prince. The work poured out of him in just a few months during 1513, drawing on everything he had learned in his years of diplomatic service, every observation he had made of how power actually worked, every lesson he had drawn from the successes and failures of rulers past and present. The book was a desperate gamble, an attempt to win the favor of the new Medici rulers and return to political life. Machiavelli dedicated it to Lorenzo de' Medici, the young man who now controlled Florence, hoping that his handbook of political wisdom might earn him an advisory position. The gamble failed. Lorenzo showed little interest in the work, and Machiavelli remained in exile. But the book itself would outlive its author and its intended audience, becoming one of the most influential and controversial texts in Western civilization. It would be condemned by the Catholic Church and placed on the index of forbidden books. It would be studied by kings and revolutionaries, capitalists and communists, tyrants and democrats. The very word Machiavellian would enter the language as a synonym for cunning and amoral manipulation. And all of this stemmed from a relatively short work, not much more than 100 pages, written by a disgraced diplomat trying to recover his career. What made The Prince so shocking, so scandalous, so enduringly influential? To understand this, we need to grasp the revolutionary framework Machiavelli introduced, the concepts of virtue and fortuna, and the radical separation of political ethics from private morality. For centuries before Machiavelli, political philosophy had been dominated by what we might call the Mirror for Princes tradition. These were books of advice for rulers, and they all shared certain assumptions. A good ruler, they taught, should be just, merciful, generous, truthful, and pious. He should rule according to Christian virtue and natural law. His goodness as a person would translate into effectiveness as a ruler. The best states were those governed by the most virtuous men. Machiavelli swept all of this aside with a single devastating observation. He would deal with the effectual truth of things, not with imaginary republics and principalities that had never existed except in the minds of philosophers. The gap between how people actually lived and how they ought to live was so great that a ruler who ignored how people actually behaved in favor of how they ought to behave would achieve nothing but his own ruin. A man who wished to be good in every respect would inevitably be destroyed among so many who were not good. This was the core of Machiavelli's revolution. He was not arguing that rulers should be evil for evil's sake. He was simply observing that in a world full of people who would not play by the rules of private morality, a ruler who insisted on always playing by those rules would lose. Politics had its own logic, separate from the logic of individual ethics. A ruler who failed to understand this distinction was doomed. At the heart of Machiavelli's analysis lies the concept of virtue. This word has caused endless confusion because it looks so much like our English word virtue and comes from the same Latin root. But for Machiavelli, virtù meant something quite different from moral goodness. It encompassed all the qualities a ruler needed to succeed: courage, strength, cunning, adaptability, decisiveness, and above all, the ability to read situations accurately and act effectively. A prince with virtue might be cruel when circumstances required cruelty and merciful when mercy served his purposes. He might break his word when keeping it would destroy him and honor his commitments when doing so increased his power. He was not bound by abstract principles, but guided by a clear-eyed assessment of what would actually work in any given situation. Virtue was, in essence, the capacity to impose one's will on the world, to shape events rather than merely react to them. Against virtù stood fortuna, the unpredictable goddess of chance, who spun her wheel without regard for human merit or plans. Machiavelli compared fortune to a raging river that floods and destroys everything in its path. But he also observed that while we cannot stop such floods, we can build dikes and channels to limit the damage and direct the waters where we wish them to go. A prince with sufficient virtue could not eliminate the role of fortune in human affairs, but he could prepare for her onslaughts and even turn her favor to his advantage. The relationship between virtù and fortuna represented, for Machiavelli, the fundamental dynamic of political life. Success required both skill and luck. The most capable ruler could be destroyed by truly terrible fortune, as Cesare Borgia was. But a ruler who blamed fortune for his failures when he had failed to prepare was simply making excuses for his own lack of virtue. The great leaders of history were those who possessed enough skill to seize the opportunities fortune offered while minimizing the damage when she turned against them. This framework led Machiavelli to conclusions that scandalized his contemporaries and continue to trouble readers today. A ruler, he argued, needed to know how to be not good. He needed to learn to use cruelty well, inflicting it all at once rather than spreading it over time, so that the initial shock would fade and people would eventually forget. He needed to understand that keeping his word was only valuable when it served his interests, that promises made under duress or in different circumstances could be broken without shame. But we must be careful here not to oversimplify Machiavelli's position. He was not simply advocating for rulers to be wicked whenever they pleased. His advice was always conditional, always tied to specific circumstances and purposes. Cruelty was acceptable only when it served a clear political goal, and only when it was executed efficiently and completely. Deception was justified only when honesty would prove fatal, and only when the deception could be maintained convincingly. Moreover, Machiavelli recognized that different situations called for different approaches. A new prince, establishing himself in a conquered territory, faced very different challenges than a hereditary ruler governing a long-settled state. The new prince might need to employ harsher methods because he lacked the legitimacy that tradition conferred. The established ruler could afford to be more generous because his position was more secure. There was no one-size-fits-all approach to governance. This sensitivity to context is one of Machiavelli's most valuable contributions to political thinking. He understood that abstract principles, however well formulated, could not simply be applied mechanically to every situation. The wise ruler needed to read circumstances carefully, to understand the particular forces at play, to calibrate responses to specific challenges. This required judgment, practical wisdom, what the ancient Greeks called phronesis. It could not be learned from books alone, but had to be developed through experience and reflection. The concept of timing was particularly important in Machiavelli's analysis. He observed that the same action could produce very different results, depending on when it was taken. A display of force that established a ruler's authority early in his reign might provoke rebellion if attempted later, when grievances had accumulated and resistance had time to organize. A gesture of reconciliation that appeared weak in a moment of crisis might strengthen a ruler's position when the crisis had passed. Knowing when to act was as important as knowing what to do. This temporal dimension of political judgment is easily overlooked by those who read Machiavelli as simply advocating ruthlessness. His advice was always about achieving specific outcomes in specific situations, and those outcomes depended critically on the timing of actions. The prince who struck too soon might provoke the very resistance he sought to prevent. The one who struck too late might find his enemies too strong to overcome. Success required not just the will to act, but the wisdom to know when action would be most effective. Machiavelli's emphasis on reading situations and adapting accordingly points to another crucial element of his thought: the role of information and intelligence in effective governance. A ruler could not make good decisions without understanding the forces and personalities arrayed around him. He needed networks of informants, skilled diplomats, trustworthy advisors who would tell him unpleasant truths. The prince who isolated himself, who surrounded himself only with flatterers, who relied on outdated information or wishful thinking, was preparing his own downfall. This insight extended to self-knowledge as well. A ruler needed to understand his own strengths and weaknesses, his tendencies and blind spots. The prince who believed himself invincible was already halfway to defeat. The one who recognized his limitations could compensate for them. Surrounding himself with people whose abilities complemented his own, avoiding situations where his weaknesses would prove fatal. Most famously, Machiavelli addressed the question of whether it is better to be loved or feared. His answer has been quoted and misquoted ever since. One would wish to be both, he acknowledged, but since it is difficult to combine them in one person, it is far safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. The reasoning behind this conclusion reveals Machiavelli's dark view of human nature. Men, he observed, are ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers. They shun danger and are greedy for profit. As long as you benefit them, they are entirely yours. They will offer their blood, their goods, their lives, and their children when the need is far off. But when need approaches, they turn away. Love is maintained by a chain of obligation which, since men are wretched creatures, is broken whenever it serves their advantage. But fear is maintained by a dread of punishment which never fails. Yet even here, Machiavelli introduced crucial nuances that are often overlooked. A prince should be feared, yes, but not hated. There is a world of difference between the two. A feared ruler inspires respect and obedience. A hated ruler inspires conspiracies and assassination attempts. The key is to avoid actions that will make you hated, particularly seizing the property and women of your subjects. You may execute men when you have proper justification. Machiavelli noted with chilling pragmatism, but never seize their property, because men sooner forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony. This brings us to the heart of the Machiavellian dilemma, the profound tension between what we might call political necessity and moral principle. Machiavelli was not arguing that morality did not exist or that it did not matter. He was arguing that in the specific arena of politics, especially in times of crisis and upheaval, a ruler might be forced to choose between being good and being effective. Consider the position of a new prince, Machiavelli's primary concern in the book. Such a ruler has no hereditary legitimacy, no long tradition of loyalty to draw upon. He faces enemies who want to restore the old order, ambitious rivals who seek to take his place, external powers waiting to exploit any weakness. In such circumstances, strict adherence to private morality might be a recipe for disaster. The merciful prince who releases captured enemies creates the instruments of his own destruction. The truthful prince who reveals his plans to the world gives his enemies the information they need to defeat him. The generous prince who distributes his wealth freely soon finds himself without the resources to defend his state. What Machiavelli offered was not a celebration of evil, but a stark recognition that in certain circumstances, a leader might face impossible choices. The idealist who refuses to get his hands dirty may preserve his personal virtue while watching his city burn and his people die. The pragmatist who does what is necessary may save his state at the cost of his soul. There is no clean answer, no way to have it both ways, but we would be wrong to see Machiavelli as simply a teacher of tyranny. Alongside The Prince, he wrote another longer work called The Discourses on Livy, a commentary on the history of the Roman Republic. In this work, a very different Machiavelli emerges, a passionate republican who believed that free states were stronger, more resilient, and more capable of greatness than principalities. He admired the Roman Republic precisely because it had found ways to channel popular energy into state power, to balance competing interests through institutions, to create a political system that could adapt and survive across centuries. The apparent contradiction between the prince favoring author of The Prince and the republic favoring author of the Discourses has puzzled scholars for centuries. Some have argued that The Prince was satire, a deliberate exaggeration meant to expose the true nature of tyrannical rule. Others have suggested that Machiavelli's views simply evolved over time. Still others see no contradiction at all. The Prince was advice for how to establish a new principality. The Discourses addressed how to maintain a free republic. Different circumstances required different approaches. What is clear is that Machiavelli's thought cannot be reduced to simple advocacy for ruthlessness. He was a man who loved liberty and hated the corrupt and divided state of Italian politics in his time. He dreamed of a united Italy free from foreign domination. He believed that ordinary citizens could be the foundation of a strong state if properly organized and led. His dark assessment of human nature coexisted with a genuine patriotism and a desire for political renewal. The dilemma Machiavelli articulated did not end with the Renaissance. It has recurred throughout history whenever leaders have faced choices between principle and pragmatism, between what is morally right and what is politically necessary. Consider Abraham Lincoln, widely regarded as one of the greatest American presidents, a man who led his nation through its deadliest conflict and ended the institution of slavery. Lincoln was, in many ways, an idealist. He hated slavery and believed in the fundamental equality of human beings. Yet he was also one of the most pragmatic politicians in American history. During the Civil War, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, allowing citizens to be detained without trial. He authorized military tribunals for civilians. He suppressed newspapers that opposed the war effort. He deferred the Emancipation Proclamation until the political and military moment was right, even as enslaved people continued to suffer. He was willing to prosecute the war with a ferocity that cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Was Lincoln a Machiavellian?
In some ways, undoubtedly, yes.
He understood that preserving the Union required means that could not always be squared with constitutional norms or peacetime morality. He made calculations about timing and politics that delayed justice for enslaved people. He pursued victory with a ruthlessness that shocked even some of his supporters. Yet Lincoln never lost sight of the moral purpose that justified these harsh measures. His aim was not personal power, but the preservation of democracy and the eventual end of slavery. The means he employed were in service of ends that most of us today recognize as profoundly good. His pragmatism was instrumental, always directed toward idealistic goals. Perhaps this is what distinguishes the statesman from the mere politician: the ability to employ Machiavellian means in service of genuinely moral ends. Winston Churchill presents another case study in the tension between pragmatism and idealism. Here was a man who wrote soaring rhetoric about freedom and democracy, who rallied a nation against fascist tyranny, who stood virtually alone against Hitler in the darkest hours of 1940. He was, in many ways, the voice of idealism in a world gone mad. Yet Churchill was also capable of remarkable ruthlessness. He ordered the bombing of German cities, knowing that tens of thousands of civilians would die. He diverted food supplies from Bengal during a famine, contributing to perhaps 3 million deaths. He supported colonial regimes that denied freedom to millions. He made alliances with Stalin, one of history's greatest mass murderers, because defeating Hitler required it. Churchill understood, perhaps better than anyone, that grand moral purposes sometimes require terrible means. He spoke openly about the woeful catalogue of actions that war demanded, about the need to pursue victory without consideration for tender feelings. He knew that he was making choices that would haunt him, that the cost of defeating Hitler included actions that could not be justified by any normal moral standard. Yet he also believed that the alternative, submission to Nazi tyranny, was worse. In his world, There were no clean hands, only degrees of moral compromise. Nelson Mandela offers yet another perspective on the dilemma. For 27 years, he remained imprisoned on Robben Island, a symbol of resistance to apartheid, a living embodiment of the moral case against racial oppression. When he finally walked free and then ascended to the presidency of South Africa, many expected him to seek vengeance against those who had imprisoned him and oppressed his people. Instead, Mandela chose reconciliation. He worked with his former enemies. He refused to pursue revolutionary transformation that might have led to civil war. He compromised with the old regime, allowing many of its members to retain power and privileges. To some, this was a betrayal of the liberation struggle, a surrender to the forces that had murdered and tortured. To others, it was pragmatic genius, the recognition that a scorched earth approach would have left nothing but ashes. Mandela's approach might be called pragmatic idealism. He held fast to certain core principles, above all the dignity and equality of all human beings. But he was flexible about means, willing to negotiate and compromise when it served his ultimate goals. He understood that politics is the art of the possible, that achieving most of what you want is better than achieving nothing in pursuit of everything. His idealism was tempered by realism, his moral vision informed by practical wisdom. The contrast between those who succeeded through this balance and those who failed through its absence is instructive. Consider the fate of those leaders who clung too rigidly to idealistic principles without regard for practical consequences. The purists, the absolutists, the ones who refused any compromise with an imperfect world. History offers many examples. The Jacobins of the French Revolution began with genuinely noble ideals: liberty, equality, fraternity. But their refusal to compromise, their insistence on ideological purity, their willingness to sacrifice anyone who fell short of their exacting standards, led directly to the terror. Thousands went to the guillotine, not because they were enemies of the revolution, but because they were insufficiently revolutionary. The pursuit of an ideal society became a nightmare precisely because it admitted no room for human imperfection. On the other side, consider those who abandoned ideals entirely in pursuit of pure power. The leaders who started with no principles beyond self-aggrandizement, or who gradually shed their principles as success corrupted them. These too have littered history with their failures, not always immediately apparent, but eventually catching up with them. Such rulers may achieve impressive short-term results. They may accumulate wealth and power beyond the dreams of ordinary people, but they create around themselves a wilderness of distrust. Every ally becomes a potential betrayer, because everyone knows that loyalty means nothing to someone who has no loyalty to give. Every success breeds new enemies, because pure power politics creates no basis for genuine reconciliation. In the end, even the most powerful such rulers often fall to plots hatched by those closest to them, killed by the same amoral logic they lived by. Machiavelli himself understood this danger, which is why he distinguished so carefully between being feared and being hated. The feared ruler commands obedience out of self-interest. The hated ruler invites assassination out of desperation. The line between them is not always clear, and many a prince has crossed it without realizing until too late. These historical examples suggest that the choice between pragmatism and idealism is rarely absolute. The greatest leaders seem to find ways to combine both, holding fast to certain core principles while remaining flexible about tactics and timing. They understand that politics operates in a fallen world where perfect solutions are rarely available, but they refuse to abandon hope for a better world entirely. Yet there is another dimension to this question that the purely political examples can obscure. The dilemma between pragmatism and idealism is not merely a matter of strategic calculation. It touches on fundamental questions of character, of who we are and who we wish to become. The person who compromises too readily, who abandons principles too easily, may find that they have lost something essential about themselves. The negotiator who gives away too much may wake one day to discover that they no longer remember what they were fighting for. The pragmatist who makes too many deals with darkness may find that the darkness has seeped into their soul. There are victories that cost more than they are worth, compromises that corrupt the compromiser. This is why purely consequentialist reasoning that focuses only on outcomes, often feels inadequate when applied to ethical dilemmas. We sense rightly that some things should not be done regardless of the consequences, that there are limits beyond which we must not go, even if going would achieve good results. The person who maintains these limits, even at significant cost, preserves something precious about their integrity as a moral agent. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher who lived more than 2 centuries after Machiavelli, articulated this intuition more systematically than anyone before or since. For Kant, the moral worth of an action depended not on its consequences but on the principle that motivated it. An action done from duty, from respect for the moral law, possessed a dignity that no merely strategic calculation could match. The person who told the truth because they believed truth-telling was their duty, regardless of consequences, stood on a higher moral plane than the one who told the truth only when it served their interests. Machiavelli would likely have dismissed Kant's approach as impractical idealism, the kind of otherworldly moralizing that accomplished nothing in the real world of politics. And indeed, Kantian ethics can seem bloodlessly abstract, disconnected from the messy realities of human life. Yet Kant's insight captures something important that Machiavelli's more practical approach tends to overlook: the intrinsic value of moral integrity, the sense that some principles are worth maintaining, even at great cost. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these two approaches, or rather encompasses both of them in a higher synthesis. We need Machiavellian realism to navigate the practical challenges of life, to understand how power actually works, to achieve the outcomes we seek. But we also need Kantian idealism to remind us why we are pursuing those outcomes in the first place, to set limits on the means we employ, to preserve the moral character that makes us worth saving. The great souls in history have somehow managed to hold both perspectives simultaneously. They have been shrewd and principled, practical and idealistic, willing to get their hands dirty while keeping their hearts clean. How exactly they managed this remains something of a mystery, a feat of moral virtuosity that cannot be fully reduced to rules or formulas. But their example shows that it can be done, that the choice between pragmatism and idealism is not the binary it sometimes appears to be. The Machiavellian dilemma extends far beyond the realm of high politics. In our own lives, we face smaller versions of the same choice. Should you tell a difficult truth that might damage a relationship, or maintain a comforting fiction that keeps the peace? Should you pursue your own advancement aggressively, using every advantage at your disposal, or hold back in deference to others who might deserve the opportunity? Should you compromise your principles to get something done, or stand firm even if it means accomplishing nothing? These everyday dilemmas may lack the world historical stakes of political decisions, but they engage the same fundamental tension between pragmatism and idealism. The choices we make in small matters reveal and shape our character, and they accumulate over time into the pattern of a life. The person who always chooses pragmatism becomes a different kind of person than the one who always chooses principle. Neither extreme is entirely admirable, and most of us zigzag between them, never quite sure whether our choices reflect wisdom or weakness. In the professional world, the dilemma manifests with particular intensity. The ambitious employee must decide how much they are willing to compromise to advance their career. Should they flatter a difficult boss, even if it feels dishonest? Should they claim credit for a colleague's work, if doing so might lead to a promotion? Should they cut corners on quality to meet an impossible deadline, knowing that no one will likely notice? Machiavelli would advise careful calculation of costs and benefits, attention to what can be concealed and what cannot, awareness of how different audiences will perceive different actions. He would remind us that reputation is a valuable asset that should not be squandered carelessly, that short-term gains often lead to long-term costs, that the appearance of integrity may be as valuable as integrity itself. His advice is not to be moral, but to be strategic, to think several moves ahead, to understand the full consequences of each choice. Yet many of us feel that something important is lost when we approach ethical decisions with purely strategic thinking. The person who does the right thing only because it pays is fundamentally different from the one who does it because it is right. Even if the external behavior is identical, the internal reality differs profoundly. And perhaps, over time, the strategic approach erodes the very capacity for genuine moral feeling, leaving only calculation where conscience once resided. The business world offers countless examples of this erosion. Companies that began with genuine commitments to quality, service, or innovation gradually sacrifice those commitments to the demands of quarterly earnings. Leaders who started their careers with idealistic visions of what they could accomplish settle into cynical management of existing structures. The pragmatic demands of survival and success slowly crowd out the idealistic impulses that once motivated. Yet we also see the opposite pattern. Businesses and leaders who maintain their core values through tremendous pressures, who prove that principle and profit need not always conflict, who demonstrate that sometimes the idealistic choice is also the practical one. These examples suggest that the dilemma, while real, is not absolute. The relationship between pragmatism and idealism is more complex than simple opposition. In the political realm, the tension between idealism and pragmatism plays out on the largest stage imaginable. Every election cycle, we see candidates who appeal to our idealistic hopes and others who appeal to our pragmatic fears. We evaluate leaders based on their stated principles and their actual accomplishments, and we often find the two do not align. The candidate who promised transformation delivers incremental change. The one who promised stability presides over upheaval. The gap between political rhetoric and political reality seems almost impossible to close. Some observers have concluded that political idealism is inherently naive, that the demands of governing inevitably corrupt even the most principled leaders. They point to the pattern that recurs across different times and political systems. The reformer who becomes the establishment, the revolutionary who becomes the tyrant, the outsider who becomes the insider. If even the most committed idealists cannot maintain their ideals once in power, perhaps the ideals themselves are the problem, unrealistic expectations that set us up for disappointment. But others draw a different conclusion from the same evidence. They argue that the corruption of idealists proves not that idealism is foolish, but that it requires constant vigilance and renewal. The problem is not that leaders start with ideals, but that they abandon them under pressure. The solution is not to start without ideals, but to develop the character and institutions that can sustain ideals through the inevitable pressures of power. This debate echoes arguments that have been going on since long before Machiavelli. Plato wrestled with the question of whether philosophers should engage in politics, knowing that political life would corrupt their love of truth. Aristotle emphasized the importance of practical wisdom, the capacity to apply general principles to particular circumstances. The Stoics advised cultivating inner virtue while accepting that external outcomes were beyond our control. Each of these ancient perspectives offers resources for thinking about the dilemma we have been exploring. There are no universal answers to these questions. What worked in Renaissance Florence may not work in a modern democracy. What is appropriate for a head of state facing existential threats may not be appropriate for a middle manager dealing with office politics. Context matters enormously, and Machiavelli himself would be the first to insist on this point. The wise person reads situations carefully and adapts accordingly. Yet certain patterns seem to recur across contexts and centuries. Pure idealism, pursued without regard for practical consequences, often ends in failure and even catastrophe. The idealist who refuses to engage with the world as it actually is may preserve personal integrity but accomplish nothing of lasting value. In extreme cases, idealistic intransigence can lead to outcomes far worse than the compromises it refused to accept. At the same time, pure pragmatism, pursued without reference to any moral principle, tends to devour itself. The leader who will do anything to stay in power eventually creates so many enemies, breaks so many promises, and commits so many betrayals that even his allies cannot trust him. Moreover, such a leader has no basis for persuading others to sacrifice and struggle on his behalf. Pure self-interest cannot inspire the kind of loyalty and dedication that great enterprises require. The sustainable path seems to lie somewhere between these extremes. It involves clarity about core principles, the non-negotiable values that define who you are and what you stand for. It involves flexibility about means, the willingness to adapt tactics to circumstances rather than clinging rigidly to a single approach. It involves prudence about timing, the recognition that sometimes the best way to achieve a goal is to wait, to build support, to let circumstances ripen, and it involves a certain tragic awareness that in this world we cannot always have everything we want, that choices involve trade-offs, that even the best outcomes carry costs. Machiavelli himself understood this. For all the shock value of his most provocative statements, he never argued that cruelty and deception were good in themselves. He presented them as sometimes necessary evils, tools to be used carefully and sparingly when gentler methods failed. He recognized that a ruler who was cruel without purpose, deceitful without necessity, would quickly lose the support of his people. The goal was always effectiveness in service of state building, not sadism for its own sake. The years after writing The Prince were not kind to Machiavelli. His gift to Lorenzo de' Medici failed to win him the political rehabilitation he sought. He remained in exile, writing prolifically, but excluded from the world of power that was his true passion. He completed the discourses on Livy, wrote a history of Florence commissioned by Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, and composed plays and poetry. His comedy, The Mandragola, became one of the most successful plays of the Italian Renaissance. Gradually, almost painfully, Machiavelli began to win back small measures of trust from the Medici regime. He was given minor diplomatic assignments, nothing like his former prominence, but a sign that he had not been entirely forgotten. When the Medici were temporarily expelled from Florence in 1527 following the sack of Rome, Machiavelli hoped that the restored republic would welcome him back to significant office. It was not to be. The new Republican government viewed him with suspicion precisely because he had cultivated the Medici during his years of exile. He had tried to serve both sides and now found himself trusted by neither. The disappointment may have been the final blow to a constitution weakened by years of stress and frustration. Niccolò Machiavelli died on June 21, 1527, at the age of 58. He was buried in the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, the same church where Galileo, Michelangelo, and many other luminaries of Italian history would eventually rest. The Prince was not published until 1532, 5 years after Machiavelli's death. Its impact was immediate and explosive. Within a few years, it was being denounced from pulpits across Europe as a handbook for tyrants, a manual of iniquity. The Catholic Church placed it on the Index of Prohibited Books in 1559. Protestant critics were equally harsh, viewing Machiavelli as a corrupt product of the corrupt papacy. Yet for all the condemnation, rulers and would-be rulers read the book avidly. They found in it a clear-eyed analysis of how power actually worked, stripped of the pious platitudes that usually clothed political discourse. Some took its lessons to heart. Others refuted its arguments in print while quietly applying them in practice. The book became inescapable, a reference point for all subsequent discussion of political ethics. Over the centuries, Machiavelli's reputation has undergone many transformations. Some have seen him as a teacher of evil, deliberately leading princes towards damnation for his own mysterious purposes. Others have viewed him as a realist, simply describing the world as it is rather than as it should be. Some have argued that The Prince is actually a satire, a deliberately extreme portrait of tyranny meant to expose its true nature. Others have emphasized his republican credentials, viewing the prince as an anomaly in a body of work devoted to free government. Perhaps the truth is that Machiavelli defies easy categorization. He was a man of his time, shaped by the chaos and violence of Renaissance Italy, yet his insights transcend that particular context. He was a patriot who dreamed of Italian unity, a republican who understood the necessities of princely power, a moralist who recognized the limits of morality in political life. He held contradictory truths in tension, refusing to resolve them into easy formulas. What remains most valuable in Machiavelli is not any particular prescription for political action, but rather his insistence on seeing clearly. He forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the gap between our ideals and our behavior, about the costs of maintaining order in a chaotic world. He refuses to let us hide behind comfortable illusions, and in doing so, he makes us better equipped to face the difficult choices that political life, and life in general, inevitably presents. As you settle deeper into the comfort of wherever you are listening, consider the dilemmas that face you in your own life. Perhaps not the grand dilemmas of princes and presidents, but the everyday choices between principle and pragmatism, between saying what you believe and saying what will work, between pursuing your own advantage and considering the claims of others. There is no formula that will resolve these tensions once and for all. The wisdom lies not in finding a final answer, but in developing the judgment to navigate each situation as it arises. It lies in knowing when to stand firm and when to bend, when to fight and when to compromise, when to speak hard truths and when to maintain politic silence. Machiavelli would remind us that fortune is always present, that circumstances change unpredictably, and that the approach that worked yesterday may fail tomorrow. He would counsel us to develop our own virtue, our capacity to read situations and act effectively. He would warn us against rigid adherence to any single principle, including rigidity itself. And he would suggest that in the end, we will be judged not by the purity of our intentions, but by the results we actually achieve. Yet Machiavelli's is not the only voice in this ancient conversation. The idealists also have their claims upon us. The prophets who called for justice regardless of consequences, the martyrs who died rather than compromised their principles, the reformers who held up visions of a better world even when such visions seemed impossibly distant. These too are part of our inheritance, and we diminish ourselves if we dismiss them too readily. Perhaps the deepest wisdom lies in holding both voices in our minds, the voice of pragmatic realism and the voice of moral aspiration. The realist without ideals becomes a mere opportunist, clever but ultimately empty. The idealist without realism becomes a dreamer, admirable but ineffective. The mature soul learns to listen to both, to be anchored in principle while remaining flexible in practice, to keep their eyes on the stars while their feet stay planted on the ground. The night is settling deeper now, and the questions that have occupied us for the past hour begin to fade into gentler contemplation. Renaissance Florence feels very far away. Its intrigues and assassinations, its brilliant art and brutal politics, belonging to a world we can barely imagine. Yet the dilemmas Machiavelli articulated remain with us, as fresh and urgent as they were 5 centuries ago. In every age, leaders must decide how much they are willing to sacrifice for power, and how much power they are willing to sacrifice for principle. In every life, individuals face choices between what is expedient and what is right. The tension never fully resolves because it reflects something deep in the human condition, our simultaneous existence as moral beings who know how we ought to live, and practical creatures who must survive in a world that does not always reward virtue. Machiavelli gave us the concepts and the vocabulary to think clearly about this tension. He tore away the comfortable veils that had obscured it. In doing so, he performed a service that endures across the centuries, even for those who reject his conclusions. By forcing us to confront the hardest questions, he made us better able to seek answers, even answers he himself might not have endorsed. The stars that looked down on Renaissance Florence looked down on us as well. The same moon that illuminated Machiavelli's evening walks through the Tuscan hills casts its gentle light through your window tonight. Time passes, circumstances change, but certain fundamental questions remain. How should we live? What do we owe to others? When is compromise wisdom, and when is it betrayal? How do we balance the claims of principle against the demands of necessity? These questions will still be asked when we are gone, just as they were asked long before we arrived. Our contribution is not to answer them definitively, because no definitive answers exist, but to engage with them honestly, to bring our best thinking and deepest values to bear upon them, and to make whatever choices we must make with as much wisdom and integrity as we can manage. As consciousness begins to drift toward the shores of sleep, carry with you Machiavelli's gift of clear sight, not his cynicism, if indeed he was cynical, but his willingness to look directly at difficult truths. The world may not be as we wish it were. People may not behave as we believe they should. The path to good outcomes may run through dark territory. These are hard truths, but knowing them makes us better equipped to navigate the complexities of life. Carry also the idealist's gift of hope, the conviction that a better world is possible, that human beings can transcend their selfish impulses, that justice and compassion can prevail. Without this hope, we would have no reason to strive, no standard against which to measure our actions, no vision to guide us through the darkness. The tension between these two gifts is not a problem to be solved, but a dynamic to be lived. It is the fundamental rhythm of human existence, the interplay of aspiration and limitation, of reaching for the stars while standing in the mud. In embracing both, we become fully human, neither naively optimistic nor bitterly cynical, but clear-eyed and engaged, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow may bring. Rest now, fellow traveler, in these nighttime meditations. Let the questions settle gently into your unconscious mind, where they can work their slow alchemy while you sleep. Tomorrow will bring its own dilemmas, its own choices between principle and pragmatism. You will face them as countless generations have faced them before, with whatever wisdom you have accumulated and whatever courage you can muster. And perhaps, in your own small way, you will add something to the great human conversation that Machiavelli joined so memorably 500 years ago. The conversation about power and virtue, about means and ends, about the kind of people we wish to be and the kind of world we wish to create. It is a conversation without end, because its questions admit no final answers. But it is also a conversation that ennobles us, that makes us more fully human, that connects us to all who have struggled before us with the same mysteries. Sweet dreams, and may you wake to face the dilemmas of tomorrow with renewed strength and gentle wisdom. The night is kind to those who seek understanding, and the dawn will come soon enough, bringing with it new opportunities to put whatever wisdom you have gained into practice. Until then, rest well in the knowledge that you are part of something larger than yourself, a continuing human effort to live well in an imperfect world. The candles that once lit Machiavelli's study have long since guttered out. The palace halls where Cesare Borgia plotted his conquests now echo only with the footsteps of tourists. Florence still stands, beautiful and enduring, testament to the human capacity for creating glory amid chaos. And the questions that occupied one restless exile in his small farmhouse near Sant'Andrea continue to pulse with life, awaiting your engagement, inviting your reflection, offering no easy answers, but perhaps, in the end, something better, the chance to think deeply about what truly matters. But before we part for the evening, let us linger a while longer with Machiavelli's wisdom, for there are depths we have not yet fully explored, nuances that reveal themselves only in quiet contemplation. Consider for a moment the central metaphor Machiavelli used to describe the relationship between human agency and fate. Fortune, he wrote, is like a raging river that floods the plains, destroying trees and buildings, washing away everything in its path. Everyone flees before it. Everyone yields to its impulse without being able to resist anywhere. Yet although this is its nature, it does not follow that men cannot make provision against it by building dikes and embankments when the weather is calm, so that when it rises again, the waters will be contained in a channel, or their force will not be so uncontrolled or harmful. This image captures something essential about Machiavelli's worldview. He was neither a naive optimist who believed human beings could fully control their destinies, nor a fatalist who thought we were mere leaves blown about by the winds of chance. He occupied a middle position, insisting that while fortune governed perhaps half of our actions, she left the other half to be governed by us. The question was not whether we could eliminate the role of chance entirely, for that was impossible, but whether we could prepare ourselves to make the most of whatever circumstances fortune presented. The practical implications of this view are profound. If fortune is truly all-powerful, then there is no point in striving, planning, or preparing. We might as well drift passively through life, accepting whatever comes. But if fortune is only partly powerful, if there is genuine space for human agency to operate, then how we prepare, how we think, how we act in moments of crisis all become critically important. The person who has built their metaphorical dikes and embankments will weather the flood far better than the one who has not. This is why Machiavelli placed such emphasis on learning from history. By studying how previous rulers had succeeded and failed, by analyzing the patterns that recurred across different times and circumstances, a prince could prepare himself for the challenges ahead. He might not know exactly what form fortune's next assault would take, but he could develop the mental flexibility and practical resources to respond effectively to whatever arose. The ancient Romans, Machiavelli observed, were masters of this kind of preparation. They did not merely react to threats as they emerged, but anticipated them, planning ahead, building alliances before they were needed, addressing problems while they were still small enough to be managed. A wise prince would do the same, never resting on his laurels, always scanning the horizon for the first signs of approaching danger. Yet preparation alone was not sufficient. Machiavelli understood that in moments of crisis, character mattered as much as calculation. A prince needed to be bold, willing to take decisive action when the moment required it. Fortune favored the young and impetuous, he suggested, because they were more willing to command her, to beat her and strike her down, rather than approaching her with cold calculation and excessive caution. This aspect of Machiavelli's thought has troubled many readers. Is he really advising rulers to be aggressive and domineering? Is there not something disturbing about his violent imagery, his suggestion that fortune must be beaten into submission? These are fair questions, and they point to real tensions in Machiavelli's worldview. He was, after all, a product of a violent age, and his language reflects the sensibilities of Renaissance Italy, but beneath the disturbing imagery lies a defensible insight. Excessive caution, Machiavelli observed, often proves more dangerous than boldness. The ruler who hesitates, who waits too long to act, who endlessly weighs options while the moment for effective action slips away, frequently achieves the worst possible outcome. Better to act decisively on imperfect information than to perfect your analysis while the situation deteriorates beyond repair. Modern psychology offers some support for this view. Research on decision-making suggests that in many situations, quick, intuitive judgments perform as well as, or better than, extended deliberation. The expert chess player who trusts their trained intuition often plays better than one who laboriously calculates every possibility. The experienced emergency responder who acts on instinct may save lives that would be lost during careful analysis. There is such a thing as overthinking, and Machiavelli recognized it 5 centuries before cognitive scientists gave it a name. Of course, this is not a license for recklessness. Machiavelli distinguished between prudent boldness and foolish aggression. The former involves taking calculated risks when circumstances favor them, acting decisively when opportunities present themselves. The latter involves rushing headlong into situations without adequate preparation, confusing motion with progress. The difference lies in judgment, in the capacity to read situations accurately and calibrate responses appropriately. This brings us back to the concept of virtù, that untranslatable quality that Machiavelli prized above all others. If we had to choose a single English word, perhaps adaptability comes closest. The prince with virtue was one who could adjust his approach to changing circumstances, who was not locked into a single mode of operation but could shift between them as needed. Machiavelli illustrated this point with a thought experiment. Suppose 2 princes govern in exactly the same way, one cautiously and one impetuously. If the times and circumstances favor caution, the cautious prince will succeed and the impetuous one will fail. But if circumstances change to favor impetuosity, their fortunes will reverse. The prince who cannot adapt will eventually be destroyed, not because his approach was wrong in itself, but because he applied it in situations where it did not fit. The truly successful ruler, therefore, was one who could be cautious when caution was needed, and bold when boldness was required, patient in some circumstances and aggressive in others, merciful at some times and cruel at others. This chameleon-like adaptability was the essence of political wisdom, the quality that separated the great leaders from the merely good ones. Yet here we encounter a paradox that Machiavelli himself acknowledged. Human nature, he observed, makes such adaptability extremely difficult. We are creatures of habit and temperament. Our characters are formed by experience and perhaps by nature, and they resist fundamental change. The cautious person finds it almost impossible to be bold, even when boldness is clearly required. The aggressive person cannot restrain themselves, even when patience would serve them better. Our very identities are bound up with our characteristic ways of approaching the world, and changing them feels like losing ourselves. This is why, Machiavelli concluded somewhat ruefully, fortune varies and men stand still. The world changes constantly, but people remain fixed in their accustomed patterns. Those patterns may serve them well for years or even decades, but eventually circumstances will shift to favor a different approach, and they will find themselves stranded, unable to adapt. The lesson here is humbling. No matter how successful we have been, no matter how well our methods have worked in the past, we must remain alert to the possibility that what worked before may not work again. The world owes us nothing, and past success provides no guarantee of future results. The only constant is change, and the only security lies in our capacity to change with it. This insight applies far beyond the realm of politics. In business, companies that dominated their industries for generations have been swept away by technological changes they failed to anticipate or adapt to. In personal relationships, approaches that worked in one phase of life may prove counterproductive in another. In our own psychological development, patterns of thought and behavior that once served us well may become obstacles to further growth. Machiavelli's advice, stripped of its political context, is essentially this: remain alert, stay flexible, never assume that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow. Be willing to question your assumptions, to revise your approaches, to let go of strategies that are no longer serving you. This is not easy counsel to follow, for it requires a kind of perpetual vigilance that most of us find exhausting. But it may be the price of surviving and thriving in a world that never stops changing. Let us turn now to another dimension of Machiavelli's thought that bears directly on the dilemma between pragmatism and idealism. Throughout The Prince and his other works, Machiavelli grappled with the relationship between appearance and reality in political life. A ruler, he argued, did not need to possess all the virtues that people admired, but he absolutely needed to appear to possess them. This sounds like a recipe for hypocrisy, and in a sense it is. Machiavelli was advising rulers to cultivate an image that might differ significantly from their true character. He was saying, in effect, that political success depends as much on managing perceptions as on actual accomplishments. The prince who is cruel but appears merciful may fare better than the one who is merciful but appears weak. Yet there is more to this advice than mere cynicism. Machiavelli understood that in politics, as in much of life, perception shapes reality. The ruler who is believed to be strong may never need to demonstrate strength, because potential challengers are deterred before they act. The ruler who is believed to be fair will find it easier to govern because subjects accept decisions they perceive as just. The management of appearances is not separate from the management of reality, but is an integral part of it. Modern communication theory has confirmed this insight in various ways. Political scientists speak of the power of narrative, the way that stories about events can become more important than the events themselves. Media scholars analyze the construction of public images and the techniques by which they are maintained or undermined. Public relations professionals devote their careers to managing perceptions, understanding that what people believe to be true often matters more than what is actually true. This places enormous pressure on political leaders to be skilled communicators, adept at crafting and projecting an image that serves their purposes. Some find this pressure corrupting, arguing that it subordinates substance to style and rewards manipulation over genuine achievement. Others see it as simply a fact of life, a constraint that leaders must navigate as best they can. Machiavelli would likely have taken the latter view. He was not particularly concerned with whether the situation was fair or ideal. His focus was always on what worked, on what actually achieved the desired results in the world as it actually existed. If managing perceptions was necessary for political success, then a wise prince would learn to manage perceptions effectively. Complaining about the necessity would accomplish nothing. But there is a deeper issue here that Machiavelli touched on only glancingly. The cultivation of appearances, taken too far, can undermine the very foundation it is meant to protect. The ruler who becomes too skilled at deception may lose the ability to form genuine relationships, to trust and be trusted, to create the bonds of loyalty that ultimately sustain any political order. The mask may become the face, and the person behind it may disappear entirely. This is the tragedy of many powerful figures throughout history. They begin by using deception as a tool, a means to legitimate ends. But the tool reshapes the user, the habits of manipulation become ingrained, and eventually they cannot be set aside, even when sincerity would serve better. The result is a kind of existential isolation, a disconnect between public image and private reality that becomes increasingly difficult to bridge. Machiavelli himself may have understood this danger better than his readers often assume. His own life was marked by a tension between his public reputation and his private self. The author of The Prince, that notorious handbook of political cunning, was in his private life a devoted family man, a lover of literature and conversation, a person who valued friendship deeply.
The disillusioned realist of his political writings coexisted with the passionate patriot who dreamed of a united Italy.
Perhaps he knew firsthand the costs of maintaining public masks, even as he advised rulers to master the art. As the night deepens around you, consider the masks you wear in your own life. The professional persona you adopt at work, the social self you present to acquaintances, the family role that shapes how you behave with relatives. These are not necessarily deceptions in the negative sense. They may be appropriate adaptations to different contexts, ways of navigating the various spheres in which we all must operate. But they do raise the question of authenticity. Which of these selves, if any, is the real you? Machiavelli would probably dismiss this question as poorly framed. For him, the relevant consideration was not which self was most authentic, but which approach was most effective in each situation. The prince who worried excessively about being true to himself might neglect the more pressing need to be effective in his role. Yet most of us are not princes, and we may reasonably place greater weight on questions of authenticity than Machiavelli did. Perhaps the solution lies in maintaining a clear sense of one's core values while remaining flexible about their expression. The adaptability Machiavelli prized need not extend to abandoning everything we believe in. It can mean finding different ways to enact the same fundamental commitments in different circumstances. The person who values honesty, for example, might express that value differently in a diplomatic negotiation than in a conversation with a close friend, without being dishonest in either case. This points toward a synthesis of pragmatism and idealism that neither Machiavelli nor his critics fully articulated. It suggests that we need not choose between rigid adherence to principle and amoral flexibility, between being true to ourselves and adapting to circumstances. We can hold fast to our deepest values while developing skill in their application, remaining constant in our ends while varying our means. Such a synthesis is easier to describe than to achieve. It requires a level of self-knowledge that many of us lack, a clarity about what truly matters to us that takes years to develop. It demands the kind of practical wisdom that comes only from experience, from making mistakes and learning from them, from observing ourselves and others in a wide variety of situations. And it calls for a certain humility, a willingness to admit that our first instincts may not always be correct, and that there may be approaches we have not yet considered. Machiavelli's own career, with its mixture of success and failure, brilliance and frustration, suggests how difficult this balance is to maintain. He was undoubtedly one of the most insightful observers of politics in Western history, yet he died in exile. His hopes for political rehabilitation unfulfilled, his vision of Italian unity unrealized. He understood the dynamics of power better than almost anyone, yet he was unable to translate that understanding into personal success. Perhaps there is a lesson here about the limits of even the clearest analysis, the gap between knowing what should be done and being able to do it. The gentle rhythm of your breathing has probably deepened by now, your muscles releasing the tensions of the day, your mind beginning to drift toward the realm of dreams. In that liminal space between waking and sleeping, the hard edges of philosophical questions begin to soften. The dilemma between pragmatism and idealism seems less urgent, less pressing than it did an hour ago. Perhaps that is as it should be. Some questions are meant to be lived with rather than answered, carried as companions through life rather than resolved and set aside. Machiavelli carried his questions to the grave, still wrestling with the problems that had occupied his mind for decades. He did not find final answers, and neither will we. But in the wrestling itself, there is something valuable, something that makes us more thoughtful, more aware, more fully engaged with the mystery of human existence. As sleep draws near, let me leave you with one final thought from the Florentine sage. Near the end of The Prince, Machiavelli wrote an exhortation to liberate Italy from the barbarians, the foreign powers that dominated and divided his beloved country. It is perhaps the most passionate passage in the book, and it reveals the idealistic heart beating beneath the pragmatic surface. Machiavelli imagined a new prince, one with the virtue to seize the moment and unite Italy under native rule. He called on such a leader to arise, to take up the cause that had been abandoned by others, to accomplish the task that history demanded. And he concluded with words from Petrarch, the great Italian poet of an earlier age: "Virtue against fury shall advance the fight, and it shall be short. For the ancient valor in Italian hearts is not yet dead." Here, in his most unguarded moment, Machiavelli revealed himself as something more than a cold analyst of power. He was a dreamer, a patriot, a man who believed that human greatness was still possible, even in a corrupt and divided world. His pragmatism was always in service of idealistic ends, even when he advised ruthless means. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the Machiavellian dilemma. We cannot escape the tension between what we wish and what we must do, between our highest aspirations and the constraints of reality. But we can, if we are wise, maintain clarity about our ultimate purposes even as we adapt our methods to circumstances. We can be pragmatic idealists or idealistic pragmatists, refusing to abandon either term of the equation. The night is fully upon us now, and the questions that have occupied our evening meditation must wait for another day. Rest well, knowing that you have engaged with some of the deepest questions that thoughtful people have asked across the centuries. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own dilemmas, its own opportunities for wisdom and folly alike. But for now, let the gentle darkness enfold you, and let sleep carry you to whatever dreams await. Good night, and thank you for joining me on this journey through time and thought. If you found peace in these explorations, please do subscribe and leave a like, as it helps these quiet philosophical conversations reach others who seek wisdom in the stillness of evening. Until our next meeting, may your sleep be restful and your dreams be gentle.